Welcome to Biblio Cultist, where I discuss books that I find interesting and the topics of history, philosophy, and fiction. Before I start the video, please remember to subscribe to the channel, share the video, like the video. So in this episode, I will go through a particular book on the topic of the Civil War. And what is interesting about this book in particular, this is not a very expensive book, but it has a lot of content and a lot of quality images. And in the case of historical books on any kind of war, the amount of pictures or paintings involved is always going to enhance the experience of the book. So this book that I bought on a Sam's Club, I'm talking about years and years ago, I would say probably 15, 20 years ago. It was very cheap. It was, in that section of books that they have in the store. And, the Civil War had a lot of great pictures and took me a few years before I tackled it. And it was a very enjoyable book because of the amount of historical information and the way it is structured. So I'll go into that, but first, it is the Civil War. The editor of the book, and in this case, I have to mention the editor because he's the one that put it together, basically, John S. Bowman. And it was published by J.G. Press in 2006. Now, the structure of the book has a lot of interesting benefits, and the reason is, first, it has a timeline, a day-by-day timeline of the events of the Civil War, which in a historical book is not very common, and I found it enjoyable because it gives me a day-to-day event timeline. This happened first, and then this battle happened here, and then Congress made this law, and then the Confederate States of America did this law. So by going piece by piece, event by event, battle by battle, it gives you a very active engagement in the history of what was happening. It also allows your mind to kind of go through the experience of the history as well. Because, when we study historical books, we're usually studying it in a very distant fashion. Events are usually narrated and they're structured in a narrative that makes it feel as if it's fiction. But by reading a day-to-day timeline, it really creates the effect of a more active participation in the story. So I love that methodology of presenting the history. It then has an encyclopedia, which goes by the last names of great participants in the story and of locations and of even particulars, right? Like particular weapons or types of rifles and that kind of thing. So you can use the encyclopedia to kind of navigate the book as well. Though I read it throughout. I just went through the whole thing from beginning to end, A, B, C, like that. And I thought it was a good way of reading it. But that encyclopedia is a very efficient way of educating on a lot of the kind of ancillary components of the history. It has another section on the weapons used in particular. So that's interesting, especially for people that really like weapons. And then at the end, you have an abridged diary of Grant, Ulysses as Grant, and of Robert E. Lee, which to me is the perfect way of finishing the work because it gives you a first-hand, in the case of General Grant, it gives you a first-hand account of the events that you already kind of went through. In the case of Robert E. Lee, it's a very good diary. It was not written by Robert E. Lee, but by one of his adjutants. But it does give you a first-hand account because he was there in almost every aspect of the story. So it's pretty close to the Grant, but the Grant's memoir is superior in the sense of, having that first-hand kind of dynamic. Now, Grant wrote that when he was practically on his deathbed, so it is a recollection of events, but it's a very good recollection of events. Now, when it comes to the dynamic of the story or the tragedy of the Civil War, I'll say a few things about it. just to give you the context of why the book is good and how the book, what kind of impressions the book will give you, and that will hopefully motivate you to find either the same book or another good book on the topic. I do think that the Civil War was a tragic event in the sense of the amount of death and destruction that it caused, and I would say for both sides. I also think that there's a psychological trauma involved in the Civil War that affected not only, obviously, Black Americans and Native Americans and I would say white Americans. I think it affected everyone. But I think it not only affected the psychology of the nation, I think it also disturbed the nation's idea of what democracy is and a republic is. The United States is a representative republic. It is not a democracy. Nothing controversial in saying this, it's just a fact. And I think that the institutions that the United States was founded upon, which were kind of rocky already from the very beginning, especially with the struggle between the Supreme Court and Thomas Jefferson. That's a topic for some other book discussion on that. But the causes of the war, which is a very particular combination of the abolitionist movement, obviously the topic of slavery itself, but also the topic of state rights and the economic juggling that was happening, because at the time you have a North that is primarily dependent on a more industrialized base of economic development, whereas the South is still an agrarian society. And you see the agrarian dynamic not only in the economics, but also in the culture. So you do have some kind of slow coming apart between these two cultures. So it is a pretty fair way of saying that each state had its own culture, its own dynamic. That is true from the beginning. But there was a tendency of having a regional identity. And that's where the issue of state rights comes in, because a lot of the dynamic of the struggle had to do with the imposition of federal power upon state power. And as a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln, for example, is known, and you can find his quotes. Some of them are in this book, in which he says things like, I don't care about the abolition of slavery, I just care about preserving the Union. So in a lot of cases, the imposition of federal law or the imposition of unity was seen as more important than even abolition. So that is kind of mind-blowing for some people and something to keep in mind. There are some absurd contradictions there, because the people who claim to defend democracy are the ones that are destroying democracy as well in a lot of cases. In other words, both sides are claiming to fight for freedom and liberty and democracy, the word is used, and for the republic. But even though this is the claim, both sides take really aggressive stances against their populations to keep them engaged in their particular sides. So I know that obviously that's how war functions, but what I'm saying is that the amount of, chest beating and proclamations that you have to absurdly go through in a contradictory fashion to kind of justify your, imposition of banning free speech, imprisoning people who have a different opinion. So in the North, they would imprison Southerners or people that were pro-Southerner, or like the Peace Democrats, for example, who were against the war. And in the South, you would have the same kind of dynamic as well. So contradictory and absurd. One good example of this is that I know it's controversial, but I have to mention it because I think it's interesting. You have the Free Soil Kansas Constitution outlawing slavery, but then They also created a law that bans blacks from moving into Kansas. So as you can see, a lot of times the abolitionist movement was not necessarily what people think, because a lot of people think of abolitionism as being some kind of modern, and this is again presentism, which I've mentioned in other videos, that we judge for good or for bad the past based on the presuppositions of the present. This is a great example of that. Just because you have abolitionists doesn't mean that they are egalitarians or in the same mindset of the civil rights in the 60s. These are not the same ideas. So this is a very important fact that has to be kept in mind. And the good thing about this book is it was not riddled with presentism. It laid out the history, but it didn't really give you the feel that they were moralizing or being highly judgmental of the people of the time. And I think that's a positive way of doing history. And another issue that I found interesting is the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln in March of 1861, where he makes the statement that the Union is perpetual. And again, that is another ironic kind of component, because if the citizens of a state elect to become part of a union of other free people as states, as part of a federal union, the moment you say it is perpetual, you're eliminating the capacity of the people to actually unelect that decision, to basically go back on that decision. So once you elect to go into the union, then you cannot get out of it, which is obviously undemocratic. I mean, just from an objective point of view, if it's an election in which I vote to become part of a union and I can't go back on that decision, or future generations can't make a different decision, then you are enforcing that decision in an undemocratic way. And there's no way of going around it. It's just a fact. So irrespective of whether or not the northern position was righteous in the case of slavery, it is difficult to not see that imposing the union itself would be unrighteous and immoral in the case of democracy. If democracy doesn't matter, then okay, no problem, it doesn't matter. But to be fair, the southern position on the argument of the insolubility of the Union is a good argument. As a matter of fact, when the Confederacy gets together, that's one of the points, that you can join the Confederacy, you can also get out of it. That's like a part of the main conception of it. And I think that issue of states' rights versus the federal government, I think it's a fair issue to take into consideration when we're discussing this. Another aspect that I found fascinating is that a lot of this conflict began as political violence. So it didn't begin as a straight up military conflict between two countries, because that is the fact. Once the Confederate States of America were founded, you have technically two countries. You have the United States of America, which is now the northern states, and you have the Confederate States of America, which are now the southern states. So we have two countries. It is called the Civil War, but technically it is a war between two nations. A civil war tends to be more an internal struggle within the same nation. So of course the concept of civil war is more akin to the position of the northern viewpoint on this. From the southern point of view, this is not technically a civil war, it is more a war, just a traditional war between two states. So that is very peculiar to consider. That gives you an example, and when you study history, that the perception of history and the presuppositions of the history are going to determine the way you even talk about the history. So, and then the technical aspects of the war. So the use of new technology in the war, so repeating rifles, revolvers, that is kind of new, and it had a huge impact on war. The use of ironclads, which are kind of quasi-submarines, was started there, and the South was actually a huge forerunner of this technology, even though they didn't really have a lot of resources. In a lot of ways, they did have a lot of technological advances that they came up with, which is very interesting. Also, the first utilization of the naval and army groups used together in coordination. Ulysses S. Grant would be one of the main geniuses behind this kind of good combination and using these variety of units in a coordinated way to achieve goals. It is kind of revolutionary at the time. So